Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the gilded halls and thorny thrones of medieval kingdoms, where being king wasn't a life of luxury, but a constant gamble with power and peril. Forget the golden crowns and lavish feasts you hear about in romance. The real duties? They were endless disputes with unruly barons, crushing demands of tribute, and betrayals sharpened like knives at every feast. So tonight we're asking why it sucked to be a medieval king, and more, where every crown could crush your head, every decree could spark rebellion, and every council meeting was a trap set by your own advisors. Every realm had its own poison, so let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now settle onto your makeshift throne, steel yourself for court intrigue, and let's unlock the burdens of royal life together. You stand on the threshold of the great hall, your hand resting on the pommel of your father's sword, though the weight of the metal feels lighter than the burden you carry in your heart. A hush falls over the assembled lords and ladies as the chamberlain steps forward with the ancient crown on a velvet cushion. You have trained for this moment since childhood, yet nothing could prepare you for the sound of your own name echoing in that vaulted chamber. You step onto the dais and feel the stones cool beneath your boots. All eyes turn to you. You sense the ghosts of every ruler who came before, their successes and failures inscribed in the tapestries that line the walls. The crown feels stiff and rough in your palms, wrought of gold and studded with jewels that glint like alarms. You lift it with trembling fingers and lower it onto your head. The circlet bites into your brow, reminding you that rule brings constant pressure rather than comfort. You hear the murmur of oaths as the nobles recite their fealty. Each pledge to defend your realm sounds like a blade being sharpened in the halls beyond. You look at the faces of the barons whose fiefs you have granted and whose lands you may now claim. You recall every slight you suffered as heir apparent, every insult traded in secret councils. Now those same men swear loyalty. You know that loyalty can fracture at the first scent of weakness. You feel the weight of obligations centuries old. The crown comes with charters and treaties signed in ink that has grown brittle. You must honor alliances forged by ancestors long dead. You must balance the rights of the church against those of merchants who pay your taxes. Every promise you inherit binds you more tightly than the jeweled crown itself. You sense that one misstep could unravel the fragile tapestry of peace that holds the realm together. A herald unfurls a scroll and reads aloud the ancient laws of the land. You listen as the words echo through the hall. They demand justice to the widow, the orphan, and the poor serf. They command the defense of borders and the punishment of traitors. You bow your head under the weight of those injunctions. You know that to rule is to accept every grievance as your own and to shoulder the burden of favor and wrath alike. The crown demands that you be both judge and warrior. You recall your first tourney as a youth when you cheered for the knight who would later lead a rebellion against your house. You stand in that moment between past folly and future mustering of armies. You sense the threat of usurpers lurking like wolves at the edge of your forest. You know that every greeting at the gate could hide a dagger or a whispered plot to seize your life and your kingdom. You feel the eyes of the Queen Mother upon you, her gaze both proud and anxious. She has guided you through years of lessons in statecraft and strategy. She raised you on tales of kings who lost their thrones by trusting the wrong man, or by failing to keep their word. You feel gratitude for her counsel and fear that you cannot live up to her example. You sense that her hopes rest on your certainty when you feel only doubt. You look around the hall at the banners of every vassal house. Each standard carries the memory of past loyalties and past betrayals. You learn that a ruler's power depends on the faith of those beneath him. You recall the baron whose lands you granted for service, yet whose cousin leads a mercenary host just beyond the border. You know that to wear the crown is to walk a path strewn with dangers you cannot behold until you stumble upon them. When the herald proclaims you king, you must step away from the dais and into the shadows of the hall. The courtiers bow and mingle, but you feel the room close around you. You overhear a whisper that the Duke of the East Wing planned a marriage alliance, only to see you wed elsewhere. You suspect he will question your authority the moment war arises or famine strikes your realm. You learn that each noble shapes his own fate to your power or against it. You feel the first drop of sweat trickle down your temple. The crown will not absorb it. You feel the jewel at the front press into your skull. You fight the urge to tear it off. You remind yourself that ceremony binds you to your duties. You must bear this burden to honor your ancestors and to protect your heirs. You must live under the crown, even when its teeth pull at your flesh. Behind you, the great doors swing open. A parade of knights files in bearing gifts of tribute, a falcon from the north, a chest of spices from the south, a pair of ivory tusks from a distant land. Each gift comes with words of congratulations, and with veiled meaning. You know that tribute can serve as both goodwill and as a shackle. You must accept each offering without showing the strain it places on your purse or your pride. You speak your first words as king. Your voice cracks at first, but you steady it with a breath you release slowly. You pledge to defend the weak, to enforce the law, and to rule with wisdom and mercy. You promise that your reign will bring prosperity and peace. You sense the lords shifting in their seats, gauging whether your words possess the weight of conviction or the burden of ignorance. When you finish your speech, the hall erupts in applause. Yet you have learned that applause can hide knives in hidden sleeves. You smile and bow, feeling the crown twist with your gesture. You step from the dais and into the throng of courtiers. Each handshake feels like a test of your strength. Each nod feels like a wager on your future. You realize that you have no respite from the demands of the crown. You depart the hall to rest in your private chambers. You stand before a looking glass and remove the crown. The room feels strangely bright once the circlet is set aside. You cradle it in your hands and study the gems and the engravings. You see the legends of past kings carved into its underside. You wonder if your name will ever be read in that same light or consigned to oblivion. You learn that the burden of the crown weighs heaviest on the man who dares to wear it. Tonight you will lie on a bed more lavish than any you have known. Yet sleep will evade you as you ponder the oath you swore, the promises you inherit, and the foes you cannot yet see. You close your eyes and pray for wisdom beyond your years. You know that to be king is to stand at the center of a world that demands perfection while offering only peril. You understand at last why only the desperate or the daring ever sought the crown. The morning after your coronation, you awaken to a new reality. The silk sheets feel cool against your skin, yet offer no comfort. You rise and dress with the help of your chamberlain and your royal seamstress. They fit you into robes of velvet, trimmed with ermine. Each stitch reminds you of the endless expense required to display royal authority. You learn that the crown demands constant upkeep of spectacle at great cost to your treasury. In the corridors you pass your treasurer, bent over a ledger so thick that its weight strains the desk. He looks up with hollow eyes and murmurs that the coffers run dangerously low. You feel the first pang of worry at your stomach. You know that raising funds will require heavier taxes or costly loans. You recall the oath you swore to protect the poor, and you tremble as you realize that neither mercy nor honor will stop the sheriff from collecting his tallies. You summon your tax collector and question him about revenues from the border counties. He swears that the sheriffs have sent all dues to the capital, yet grain from the far north has not arrived, and coin from the southern ports remains unaccounted for. You summon the barons of those regions and demand answers. They bow with false smiles and promise that any shortfall is the fault of local thieves. You sense their relief when you refrain from punishing them directly. You learn that to maintain peace, you sometimes must swallow injustice in silence. You retire to your council chamber and review the ancient debts owed to foreign princes. Treaties signed by ancestors no longer living bind you to annual payments of wool and silver. Failure to deliver could invite war or excommunication. You sign the indentures with a heavy hand. You feel the weight of those signatures, like iron links around your wrists. You learn that the crown inherits every promise ever uttered by your line, even those made under duress or deception. Your steward presents a list of festivals and tournaments promised to your nobles. Each event will cost your treasury a sum greater than the daily wages of 1,000 peasants. Yet failure to honor these entertainments could shatter the loyalty of your vassals. You realize that the crown demands generosity beyond your means. Each feast becomes a gamble with your solvency and with the faith of those whose service you require. You think of the coronation feast held in the great hall. You remember the mountains of roasted meat and the barrels of vintage wine. You watched the lords grow merry as trumpets sounded and jesters tumbled. Yet behind the laughter you saw the merchants' ledgers bulge with debt and the cooks' cellars grow bare. That feast cost the realm more than a farmer's lifetime of labor could repay. You learn that every display of royal splendor comes at the expense of the common folk. Later that day, you meet your chancellor to discuss justice in the realm. He presents cases of disputes over land and titles. You listen to the pleas of widows and the protests of minor nobles. Each judgment you render must balance ancient custom with the need to keep the peace. You feel the burden of dozens of lives resting on your words. You learn that kingship makes you the ultimate arbiter, yet offers no respite from the sorrow of those who lose their claims. At dusk, you retreat to your private oratory. You kneel before a gilded crucifix and light a candle in memory of your father. You confess your fears of failure and your doubts of right to rule. You ask for divine guidance, yet know that salvation on earth depends on the loyalty of men more than on the intercession of saints. You learn that the king's spiritual duties demand a measure of piety he may not feel. Your chaplain reminds you that you must soon meet the bishop to formalize an alliance with the church. You recall the day your father signed a concordat, granting tithes and privileges in exchange for support against a rival claimant. You wonder whether you can renew those terms without sacrificing your people's welfare. You learn that the crown stands always between worldly power and spiritual authority, forced to thread a needle finer than any church spire. That evening you dine alone in the solar. The servants clear the table, leaving only a loaf of bread and a jug of spiced wine. You eat in silence, tasting the salt of your tears more than the flavor of the food. You stare at a portrait of your ancestors sizing you up with stern gazes. You imagine them judging your every choice. You learn that the burden of legacy can weigh as heavily as the crown itself. When you rise from the table, you notice a draft from a cracked window. You call for your guard and order the sill repaired. You consider that every stone in the castle requires constant maintenance. You question the cost of staff repairs and of materials imported from distant quarries. You learn that a king's home can never be at rest, as every battlement and every beam demands his attention and his purse. You spend the remaining hours pacing your private apartments. You test the hilt of your sword and the fit of your gloves. You practice a few lines of your nightly prayer. You recall the words recited at your coronation and vow to honor them, despite the weight of power pressing against your shoulders. You learn that only by accepting the crown's burden can you hope to bear it once more on the morrow. Tonight you will sleep in a bed of silk and velvet, yet wake with a mind as restless as a stormy sea. You know that inheritance brought you to this throne, yet offers no map for the journey ahead. You understand that to be king is to carry not only the crown but the chains of obligation forged by time and by men's oaths. You will rise at first light, to face your council and your court, to bear the burden of rule once more. You step through the towering doors of the council chamber before dawn's first light, your cloak brushing the marble floor. Torches line the walls and cast flickering shadows across the long table that dominates the room. At its far end sits the high seat you now occupy. Around you, barons and advisors file in silently, each man gauging you with careful eyes. You feel the weight of 100 whispered plots pressing in the air. As the doors close, you rise to your feet, the echo of your boots rattling through the hall. You clear your throat and speak the words you have memorized since your coronation. You call the meeting to order. A hush falls. You learn in that moment that authority begins with the courage to stand alone, while dozens of pairs of eyes test your resolve. The Chancellor rises first, a scholar of parchment and ink. He lays before you ledgers that number every coin in the treasury and every debt owed by the crown. He reminds you of your father's promise to the Merchants' Guild and of the treaty with the neighboring duke. You listen as the council disputes each line, some calling for increased taxes, others warning of revolt if the levy grows too heavy. You learn that every financial decision in council is a gamble between revenue and rebellion. A baron from the East Wing stands next. He speaks in measured tones about the need for new roads to carry troops to the border. You watch his fingers tap the carved chair arm. He reminds you of raids last winter and demands the crown support his levy of knights. A rival baron seated opposite grips his goblet and demands that the crown build fortifications instead, accusing the East Wing of seeking war to seize more land. You feel the tension coil like steel in the room. You learn that every request for aid may mask a bid for power. You clear your throat again and demand options rather than complaints. You call for proposals. The Master of Works outlines plans for a roadway along the river. The Marshal of the Army suggests a new watchtower on the northern hill. You weigh each plan against the dwindling coffers you heard reported only hours ago. You learn that a king's strength lies in choosing between imperfect solutions. As debate swirls, you notice the bishop rising to speak. He reminds you of your obligation to the church. He speaks of tithes promised in the last council and of the poor who starve while abbeys flourish. He demands careful stewardship of harvests and charity to the needy. He warns of excommunication if the crown turns a blind eye to the starving. You learn that in council you must balance temporal power with spiritual mandate. Next, the Chamberlain introduces a guest envoy from the south. He carries a letter sealed with the Duke's crest. He offers an alliance sealed by marriage and a promise of troops should you grant a dowry of land. The barons exchange glances. Some nod in favor, others whisper of shattered estates and lost autonomy. You learn that foreign policy flows from halls like this where promises are made in secret and debated in daylight. A hush settles as the Chamberlain withdraws. You scan the room and see the Marshal of the Army leaning close to the Lord Treasurer, whispering in earnest tones. You feel the chamber's dust settle over old grievances. You learn that the council's true work is not the public debate, but the private discussions in corners where vows are exchanged and betrayals plotted. You stand and pound the table with a gauntleted fist. The sound echoes and the council falls silent. You demand a vote on the road project first before renewing any treaty payments. You learn that a firm decision can break the cycle of endless talk and force your rivals to reveal their true aims. Hands raise for the road plan and then for the dowry alliance. When the votes are counted, you see that you have just enough support to proceed with the river route, but not enough to seal the marriage pact. You nod and order the Chamberlain to draft the commission. You learn that narrow majorities carry you one step forward, but leave the other chamber door wide open. Scribes scratch at quills in bowls of ink, while you turn your attention to the Baron of the West Wing. He complains that his knights are unpaid for months. He demands double the stipend, or he will withdraw his banner from your next muster. You see the tension ripple across the room. You learn that promises of pay become tools of blackmail when the crown's purse runs shallow. You open the treasury ledger and see the imbalance. You recall the Chancellor's warning of debts to foreign bankers and of loans taken at high interest. You have already pledged taxes on the upcoming harvest. There is no coin left for knights. You bow your head and say that you will address the matter in the next council, but for now must focus on urgent border defenses. You learn that delay may anger one man, but outraged lords often wait for tomorrow's dawn in hope of a different answer. As the day wears on, you watch the council fracture into factions. You see the East Wing plotting the road your vote favored. You see the South Wing allies sharing secret letters. You see the bishop quietly conferring with the chamberlain over church properties. You learn that the council chamber becomes a chessboard where every piece moves with hidden purpose. Exhaustion tugs at your limbs, yet you rise again to maintain order. You end the meeting but summon the barons to supper in the private hall. You intend to break bread and to watch who sits beside whom. You learn that alliances show themselves most clearly at table where shared cups bind new bonds. At the feast, you offer each lord a cup and a seat. You watch as the Baron of the East Wing feeds bread to the marshal. You see the southern envoy share wine with the chamberlain. You learn that council debates spin into fellowship when cups rise and egos soften with each toast. Late that night, you return to your private chambers. The corridors are empty, the doors locked. You remove the ermine cloak and set it aside. You feel the ache in your shoulders from standing for hours. You sit at your writing desk and review the day's decisions. You see the road commission, the drafts of treaties, the promises of pay. You sense the precarious threads that hold your realm in place. You rise and pace the chamber. You recall each voice in council and each whispered aside. You know that some will keep their word and some will betray you at first chance. You learn that to wear the crown is to command a realm built on trust as fragile as spun glass. You kneel before a small altar in the corner. You ask for guidance in discerning truth among lies. You pray for wisdom to see the plots before they strike and for courage to face them when they do. You learn that a king's dawn begins not with trumpets but with quiet reflection on the burdens he must bear alone. After the council breaks, you find yourself in the antechamber where barons hesitate in the torchlight. You linger by the tapestries and listen as they confer in hushed tones. The East Wing Baron praises your decision on the river road and presses you for further lands to secure his support. You nod politely, yet remember the West Wing Baron, who demands compensation for his loss. You learn that council business extends beyond formal votes into a tangled web of whispered bargains. You step into the private gallery and find the chamberlain waiting with a sealed parchment. He produces it and tells you it comes from the Baron of the Southern Marches. The Baron offers cavalry support in the next campaign in exchange for highway tolls for his men. You scan the letter's careful wording and sense the calculations beneath each sentence. You learn that every alliance comes wrapped in conditions that bind your crown as tightly as any oath. As you walk through the gallery, you encounter the Marshal of the Army. He bows and reminds you of the border raids that plague your northern frontier. He asks for permission to conscript an additional 100 men for patrols. You hesitate, knowing your treasury cannot pay their wages. He presses his case, stressing the risk of invasion if you delay. You promise to consider his request in tomorrow's council. You learn that councils end, but decisions never truly rest until everyone's demands are temporarily satisfied. You then slip into the library to seek counsel from your chancellor on how to fund the marshal's force. Books line the shelves, but the key volumes are locked within stone chests that only the chamberlain's seal can open. You realize that knowledge in this realm is guarded by politics as much as by locks. You learn that even your chancellor's advice arrives tempered by the priorities of powerful lords who control the archives. Late that evening, your steward summons you to a small chamber lit by one lamp. He spreads out rolls of parchment. He shows you receipts for the royal baker and for grain purchased from merchants in the south. He points out the balance sheets for the year and the spring harvest that failed. You stare at the columns of numbers until they blur. You learn that behind every grand council decision lies a ledger that tallies promises and debts in equal measure. Your steward then produces a second list of debts incurred by your predecessors. Loans from foreign bankers carry interest rates that consume the revenue of entire counties. Promissory notes signed in crisis now come due. You run a hand across your face and feel the rough stubble of worry. You learn that the crown inherits not only land and titles, but also obligations of credit that can cripple a kingdom in a single season. You retire to your solar with a small group of trusted advisors. They include the Queen Mother, the Chancellor, and your personal chaplain. You convene an after-hours council to consider emergency measures. You debate whether to impose a distraint on disputed lands or to levy a temporary tithe on church properties. The Queen Mother objects that the people suffer as much as the crown. You feel torn between the need for revenue and the oath you swore to protect the poor. You learn that leadership demands choice between two evils. The Chancellor proposes cutting back on court entertainments and on the lavish festivals that mark each saint's day. He suggests closing unused wings of the palace and reducing the size of the royal household. You see relief flicker on the steward's face, but worry the barons will hear of frugality and interpret it as weakness. You learn that a king must balance austerity with the pageantry that keeps nobles loyal. Your chaplain offers a solution rooted in charity. He urges you to call for voluntary offerings from the wealthy nobles to feed the hungry and to support border knights. He reminds you of the power of piety to unite a realm in shared sacrifice. You see conviction in his eyes and feel the stir of purpose in your heart. You learn that moral authority can sometimes inspire cooperation where coin cannot. You draft a proclamation calling upon your barons and bishops to contribute to a royal relief fund. You sign it with your signet ring and order it sent to every fortress and cathedral. You learn that any appeal to faith must be followed by visible acts to maintain credibility. The next morning, you reconvene the full council. You stand at the head of the table and present the relief fund plan. The chamber falls silent. You watch each baron's face for reaction. You see the East Wing Baron nod in approval. You see the West Wing Baron purse his lips in disdain. You feel both anticipation and dread as you propose, sharing the burden with the church and with the greater lords of the realm. Voices rise. Some favor the plan as a demonstration of unity. Others denounce it as a tax disguised by doctrine. You listen without speaking until the council's fervor wanes. Then you remind them that the realm faces threats both at home and abroad. You describe the raids along the border and the bread riots at the farm towns. You urge them to see common cause in the crown's survival. You learn that a king's persuasive power lies in the ability to appeal to shared peril. Finally, the council agrees to the relief fund. Each baron pledges a sum to the treasury or grain to the stores. The bishops promise tithes in coin and in kind. You feel the weight of this fragile consensus settle like mist over the chamber. You learn that unity in council can be achieved when every member fears the alternative. After the council breaks, you find the Baron of the West Wing waiting in the corridor. He bows with an exaggerated flourish. He tells you he will deliver his contribution by noon. You accept his promise, though you remember his earlier objections. You learn that private assurances, secured face-to-face, matter as much as public votes. You then pass the Chamberlain's office and see him studying the incoming scrolls. He looks up at you and offers a rare smile. He says that the relief fund might ease the treasury's burden. You thank him and note the relief in his tired eyes. You learn that even the smallest consolation can brighten the darkest hour in a council of strife. At the end of the day, you stroll through the palace garden with your queen. She tucks a strand of hair behind her ear and remarks that you handled the council with wisdom beyond your years. You feel the weight of her words and of her support. You learn that a king's greatest ally may be the partner who stands beside him, sharing the burden of the crown. Tonight you return to your private oratory to record the day's events in the Royal Chronicle. You write lines that speak of grave decisions and of hard-won unity. You vow to remember every voice in council and every pledge made under torchlight. You learn that a king's legacy depends on the council's deeds as much as on the crown he wears. Before sleep, you kneel and pray for continued wisdom. You ask that the alliances forged this day hold fast against the storms ahead. You know that tomorrow the council will reconvene and that new perils will demand fresh debate. You steel yourself for another round of shadows and whispers, mindful that the call of the council never ends for a king who must rule both openly and in secret. You rise before dawn and step into the chill of the royal stables. Your steward waits beside a chestnut mare, its breath steaming in the air. He hands you a sheaf of parchment with lists of men owing taxes this season. You feel the weight of those names before you mount. Each line is a vow extracted from the poor and the prosperous alike. You learn that to fill the treasury you must lean on every shoulder in your realm. The first stop is the manor of Aldrich the miller, whose windmill grinds grain for a dozen villages. You dismount at the gate and find him waiting with his miller's cap tucked beneath his arm. He bows low and offers you a loaf of fresh bread stained with the dust of early mornings. You accept the gift and return to your steward, who shows you the mill's accounts. Last year's production underreported by a bushel in each bag. You summon Aldrich to appear before you in the great hall tomorrow, or face a fine twice the missing grain. You learn that every kindness masks a demand. Next, you travel to a hamlet of wattle cottages and lean how the peasants scrape a living from the land. You see children herding goats and old women weaving baskets. You call for the reeve, who collects the hovel rents and grazing fees. He trembles when you present the crown's tally, which exceeds the peasant's yearly yield. He begs for mercy, saying the harvest failed when the spring rains turned to hail. You close your eyes against the guilty faces of the villagers. You learn that mercy may starve the treasury, and that justice sometimes demands cruelty. You raise your hand and decree a reduced levy this season, half the usual grain and only a token coin. The peasants kneel in relief. You sense their gratitude, but also the fear that next year's tax might rise to fill this year's shortfall. You learn that generosity can bring loyalty, yet sow the seeds of future burden. That afternoon you visit the market town 2 miles from the manor. Merchants hawk bolts of cloth and crates of wine. You pause before a stall of silks dyed in rare reds. You approach the merchant who handles the shimmering folds. He bows and offers you a sample on your fingertips. You ask him to account for his sales this quarter. He produces a ledger that shows profits far beyond the taxes he claimed. You suspect smuggling or collusion. You learn that wealth invites schemes to evade the crown's share. You summon the town reeve and accuse him of complicity. He blusters that the merchants account only for what they report and that no other records exist. You study the stalls and the gaunt faces of the laborers who carry crates. You realize that to enforce honest accounting, you must station royal inspectors in this town month after month. That will cost more coin than the king's share of the merchants' taxes. You learn that oversight can be a heavier burden than evasion. As the sun sinks, you return to your capital city, weary yet resolved. You enter the treasury chamber, where your treasurer greets you with a stack of sealed pouches. He hands you the day's take, coins from tolls at the river ford, from fines on late shipments, from levies on newly married couples who hold lavish weddings. You lift each bag and feel the cold weight of metal. You learn that taxes come in many forms, and that each pence represents tears shed or joys postponed. You retire to the council chamber to review the month's returns. Barons and burghers gather, each hoping you will share their burden or postpone their dues. You see the noble whose lands lie fallow after war protests that he can pay only half the usual subsidy. You hear the merchant guild demand relief for their caravans raided by highwaymen. You learn that everyone seeks exception to the rule that goes by the king's pen. A chorus of pleas rises. You stand and raise your voice above the clamor. You remind them that the realm needs a standing army, maintained roads, and courts of justice. You speak of peace on the borders and of the schoolhouses built in humble villages where children learn to read the Psalms. You show them the ledger of expenses for grain distributed to the poor in last winter's famine. You learn that a king's best defense of taxation lies in transparency and in showing where every penny goes. The chamber falls silent. You propose a compromise. Nobles provide knights and grain in kind, while merchants pay in coin. You exhort the towns to contribute labor to road repairs and farming cooperatives to raise communal reserves. The council debates. You watch as barons and mayors weigh their own interests against the common good. You learn that solving the realm's needs demands creativity and coalition, rather than decree alone. That evening, you retire to your solar and study reports from distant shires. You read of forest cloaks smuggled across the mountain passes, and of grain stolen on coastal ships. You read of new customs duties levied in the ports of the south, and of farmers desperate enough to flee their fields. You feel the ache of responsibility in every line. You learn that the crown's reach can never cover every crime or every evasion. You summon your treasurer once more. You instruct him to send surveyors to the eastern valleys and to establish new market posts in the north. You ask for a report on the crown's investments in salt works and in mining leases. You learn that taxes are only the first step. A king must also foster wealth so that future levies do not crush the realm. Late that night, in your private chapel, you kneel before the statue of your sainted predecessor. You confess the heavy choices you made today. You ask for forgiveness for raising burdens and for wisdom to wield your power fairly. You rise and feel the silence press around you. You learn that no penance can erase the weight of a single coin taken from the hungry. Before sleep, you recall the faces of the peasants who knelt in relief and of the merchants who bowed with grudging respect. You realize that your role demands both stern judgment and compassionate mercy. You vow tomorrow to balance the needs of your treasury with the welfare of your people. You learn that the toll of taxes is the defining burden of kingship, and that only those with both courage and humility can hope to bear it without breaking. You rise before dawn again, this time to ride with your tax collectors rather than to dispatch orders from the throne. A stout coach carries you and 2 royal assessors deep into the heartland. You pass villages still harvesting the last sheaves of rye. Each thatched cottage stands in shadow of the taxman's visit. You know that the people wake in dread of your arrival. At midday, you arrive in a village where the soil yields little. You dismount and stand before the reeve's crooked hut. He bows with a grimace and hands you his account scroll. The total sum demands more grain than the villagers have yet to thresh. You sense the reeve's guilt. He pleads for a reduction but reminds you that the baron of the region expects full payment to defend the border. You feel torn. You must fulfill your baron's need for revenue while guarding against a peasant uprising. You settle on a compromise. You grant a 1/3 reduction for this season, yet order the baron to supply extra troops to oversee the harvest. The villagers bow in relief, but you see the flicker of resentment in their eyes. You learn that each concession costs the crown in soldiers and in honor, and that each saving you grant today becomes a threat to the treasury tomorrow. As you return to the main road, you hear shouts from a nearby clearing. You spur your horse toward a crowd of villagers brandishing pitchforks. A militia captain stands at their head, his armor battered and his face lined with fatigue. He accuses your overseers of exacting outrageous levies. He demands that you take back your taxes, or he will march on the nearest manor. You dismount and stand before the militia captain, your cloak stained with dust. You speak in calm tones. You explain that the levies are necessary for the realm's defense and for the maintenance of roads that serve the villagers as well as the baron. You offer to send grain and to delay coin payments until the next harvest. You learn that in the face of anger, you must temper authority with respect and with acts of service. The captain listens as the crowd quiets. He bows and orders the villagers to disperse. He tells you he will deliver the grain from what he can store and will collect coin in months to come. You nod and mount your horse. You realize that taxes can be enforced by force alone or by reason supported by goodwill. You learn that a king must choose between marching armies and mending grace. That evening you return to the court dusty and weary. The chamberlain greets you with a goblet of spiced wine. He asks for word of the northern villages. You describe the compromise you reached and warn of unrest in the east. You see the chamberlain's eyes narrow. He admires your diplomacy, yet laments the loss of revenue. You learn that your temptation will always be to sacrifice the people's relief for the crown's coffers. You retire to the treasury with your steward. You hand him the revised account scrolls and update the budget. You see the sum of the relief measures deducted from expected revenue. You learn that each act of mercy must be accounted for in the crown's books. You sense that mercy comes at a permanent cost to the realm's finances. Late that night, you convene an emergency meeting with the baron of the region involved. You ask him to shoulder the vineyard taxes for the next 2 seasons in exchange for the village's peace. He scoffs until you remind him that his fiefs border the raids that plague the kingdom. He bows and agrees, but only if you grant him the rights to collect tolls on a newly constructed bridge. You see the fine print of his demand and hesitate before you sign. You learn that bargains made to appease one group can burden another. In the days that follow, foreign merchants arrive seeking safe passage for silk and spices. They negotiate reduced duties in exchange for loans to the crown. You meet them in the royal exchange. You enjoy their exotic goods, yet know that each concession diminishes your revenue and binds you to future repayment. You learn that merchandising privileges can bring much-needed income today, yet carry the risk of favoritism and resentment from native guilds. A week after the village uprising, you receive a letter from a distant cathedral. The archbishop demands full tithes from every parish. He cites ancient privileges granted by your grandfather. You recall your promise to the chaplain to respect church rights. You learn that the church stands apart from secular levies and that your need for coin may clash with the power of the mitre. You summon your council and debate whether to withhold tithes this season. The barons call it sacrilege. The chancellor warns of excommunication. The bishop of your court pleads for restraint. You weigh the duke's need for war funds against the archbishop's spiritual authority. You learn that in the cauldron of taxes, nothing is settled by law alone. Every decision must consider allegiances that transcend borders. After hours of discussion, you promise the church an immediate payment and ask for time to raise the balance. You taste the bitterness of compromise. You learn that each concession to one power invites future demands from another. The crown stands between temporal tolls and spiritual dues. When the archbishop's messenger departs, you sink into your chair, exhausted. You feel the weight of every petition and of every revolt. You hear the echo of pitchforks and the rustle of parchments counting debts. You learn that the crown's strength lies in the constant balancing of burdens among every class in the kingdom. As dawn breaks again, you prepare to ride once more. You clench the reins and think of the villagers waiting for your decision. You steel your heart against the pleas of hunger and clamour of profit. You know that in every taxing measure, you must choose between the strength of the realm and the suffering of its people. You learn that taxation is not merely revenue, it is the measure of a king's wisdom and the true test of his mercy. You awaken before dawn to the clang of the war horn echoing across the courtyard. You grab your sword and don your breastplate, its cold metal pressing into your chest as you mount your warhorse. The caparisoned steed neighs, sensing the urgency of the moment. You know that this summons means your realm calls you to war. You learn in that instant that a king's greatest duty is to raise arms and to lead his people into battle. By mid-morning, you stand on the green outside the castle gates where your marshals have gathered the banners of every vassal house. Knights and men-at-arms line up in tight formation. You walk the ranks, greeting each lord by name. You feel their gazes weigh on you, measuring your strength and your resolve. You learn that a king's authority is only as firm as the loyalty of those who bear his standard. You address the assembled army. You speak of honor and of defending the realm against the threat beyond your border. You remind your men of the crops they stole from your people and of the villages they burned. Their cheers rise like thunder. You feel a surge of pride and fear. You learn that inspiring men to fight demands both courage and the promise of justice. Your first task is to provision the army. You ride with your quartermasters to the castle storehouses. You inspect piles of salted meat and barrels of beer. You order wagons loaded with dried grains and hard cheeses. You taste a piece of dried beef and find it tough but necessary. You learn that armies live by food as much as by sword and shield. The road to the front lies miles away across rolling hills and dense woods. You lead your column through muddy tracks that swallow the hooves of your horses. You smell the churn of damp earth and the sweat of the men beside you. You pass farms abandoned by fleeing peasants. You learn that war demands not only men but also the sacrifice of land and the exodus of families. Night falls, and you camp beneath the trees. You sit by a small fire and share a bowl of gruel with your captain of the guard. He tells you of the scouts who report the enemy gathering at the far ridge. He warns that their numbers may exceed yours. You swallow the gruel, tasting only your own fear. You learn that uncertainty gnaws at a king's heart more than any blade. Dawn brings the march to the river crossing. The wagons creak as they roll into the shallow ford. You watch as each driver guides his cattle across. The water is icy cold. You feel the chill in your boots and the tightening of your limbs. You remind yourself that the campaign will test every bone in your body. You learn that a king must endure the same hardships as his men. On the far bank, you find the enemy waiting behind hastily built palisades. Their banners snap in the wind. You review your options with your commander. You can storm the walls at once or seek a ford upstream. Each choice carries risk. A frontal assault may break the enemy quickly or may shatter your forces. You learn that war is a calculus of blood and bravery, weighed against the lives of your soldiers. You decide to divide your forces. You send a flanking party under the banner of the Duke of the West Wing while you lead the main charge. At your signal, the trumpets blare. You raise your sword high and shout the call to charge. Your men respond with a roar. You surge forward into the fray, the clash of steel ringing in your ears. You learn that the moment before battle is a crucible that forges fear into resolve. The battle is a blur of screams and steel. You feel the jolt as your horse is struck by an arrow. You struggle in the saddle but press on. You draw fresh breath and lower your visor. You see the enemy's spearmen forming a wall of points. You call for your knights to ride around their flank. You learn that even amidst chaos, a king must cling to strategy and to quick decisions.
You watch as your flanking force crashes into the enemy's rear. They waver and break. You press the attack. The smell of sweat and blood hangs over the field. You see bodies of friend and foe alike fallen in the mud. You feel the sting of spattered gore on your visor and your cheek. You learn that victory tastes of sorrow as much as it does of triumph. When the enemy flees, you order your men to fall back and to search for survivors and prisoners. You see knights stripped of armor and peasants wounded and weeping. You offer water and healing salves from your surgeon's kit. You learn that compassion can save more lives than any sword. At dusk, you gather your commanders around a map on a makeshift table. You discuss the next moves to secure the border. You learn that war never ends at the first victory. It demands constant vigilance and the rebalancing of forces. Night brings no rest. You sit by a small brazier in your tent and pore over petitions from your captains. They ask for reinforcements for the outlying garrisons and for supplies for the wounded. Your hand aches from signing orders. You learn that a king's workload in war grows as every victory reveals new fronts to defend. As dawn breaks, you rise and peer at the field below. You see the scattered tents of your encampment and the plumes of smoke from morning fires. You smell the tang of burnt wood and of cooking meat. You mount your horse once more and ride the lines of your army, speaking to each company in turn. You learn that a king must show himself often in war, or risk his men's morale fading with each passing hour. You carry news of your victory to the towns you pass. You stop at a battered village and distribute coins and bread from your treasury. You learn that acts of generosity maintain loyalty among subjects beleaguered by war. By the time you return to your capital, the campaign costs weigh on you like a millstone. You count the gold spent, the men lost, and the villages ravaged. You feel the pain of victory etched into every ledger and every scar. You learn that war tests a king's strength of arm and of heart, and that every conquest demands a price paid by both the living and the fallen. The sun beats down on the narrow road as your army presses deeper into enemy territory. The ground is churned to thick mud by the hooves of horses and the footfalls of soldiers. You ride at the front, your cloak stained with dirt and sweat. You hear the groan of wagons burdened with siege engines and supplies. Each wheel sinks into the mire and must be pried free by shivering men. You learn that armies live on the back of their baggage trains and perish when they fail to move. At midday, you arrive at the foot of a ruined castle perched on a rocky hill. Its walls are cracked and ivy chokes the arrow slits. You dismount and study the defenses with your engineers. They sketch lines of approach on a scrap of parchment. You learn that capturing a fortress demands patience and that hasty assaults invite slaughter. You order the construction of earthworks and a wooden palisade to shelter your men. The soldiers fell trees with axes and shovel earth into troughs beneath the wall. You feel the splinter of wood in your gloved palms as you help shore up the rampart. You learn that building siege works can be more deadly than meeting the enemy in open fight when archers rain arrows down on every back bent over a spade. Night brings the clash of hammer on wood as your carpenters fit timber braces. You wander the camp and see soldiers huddled around small fires. Their faces are streaked with soot and grime. They eat dried meat and handfuls of grain. They joke in whispered voices about their missing wives and their debts back home. You learn that a long campaign wears on men's spirits more than on their bodies. At dawn, you awaken to the roar of the castle's defenders. They have set fire to a wooden tower of your siege works. Flames lick the sky and send black smoke drifting over your lines. You raise the banner for retreat only to see the defenders pouring oil through arrow slits. You command your men to hold fast. You lead a charge across the burning breach to drive back the defenders. You learn that siege warfare demands both endurance and sudden violence with no warning. You fall back when the fire grows too fierce. You watch as the timberwork collapses in a thunderous crash. You feel the heat in your face and smell the smoke in your lungs. You cough and wipe your eyes. You learn that the life of a king in war is a mixture of triumph and disaster in the same breath.
That afternoon, your surgeon visits the wounded lines. You follow him through rows of stretchers, where men lie with arrows in their joints and lashes across their backs. The surgeon removes a barbed arrow from a soldier's thigh and cauterizes the wound with a heated iron. The soldier screams until he passes out. You learn that the price of victory is measured in agony, and that medicine in war brings both relief and fresh pain. You ride to the tents of your captains to plan the next assault. They tell you of lost morale and of supplies dwindling. Their men grow sick, with fever from wading through the wetlands surrounding the castle. Dysentery spreads through the ranks like wildfire. You learn that disease kills more soldiers than enemy swords, and that a king must guard his camp as fiercely as his front lines. You order your quartermasters to distribute extra barrels of clean water and to burn the worst of the wet straw bedding. You commit more men to dig latrines well away from the camp. A few soldiers grumble at the extra labor in their exhaustion, but most accept the orders. You learn that good camp discipline can reduce illness and restore hope among weary men. As night falls once more, you stand atop the battered earthwork. You see the flicker of torches within the castle and hear the distant chant of its garrison. You raise your sword in salute and vow to take that keep. You learn that a king must steel himself to face each new dawn as a fresh battle. The next morning you prepare your engines. You have built a trebuchet large enough to hurl stones that weigh more than a man. You watch as stones arc through the sky and crash into the inner ward. Dust clouds rise and defenders scramble to man the wall. You order your men to bring forward the battering ram. You hear its head crashing against the gates like thunder. Your men chant your name as each blow splinters the wood. You learn that the roar of engines can shake the courage of defenders more than any siege tower. At last the gates give way. You lead the charge into the courtyard. You see defenders surrendering with hands raised. You call a halt. You spare the lives of those who yield and secure the surrender of the garrison. You learn that tempering wrath with mercy wins loyalty and spares the burden of running a hostile town. Inside the keep you find the enemy, Lord hiding in his chamber. He kneels before you and offers the castle's keys. You accept them and spare his life under oath of fealty. You learn that war ends not with the sword but with the bending of the knee. As dusk closes, you ride out beneath the banner of your captive lord. His men lower the drawbridge and line the walls in salute. You feel the power of the king who conquers, but also the burden of ruling new subjects. You learn that every victory expands your realm and demands fresh resources to garrison and to govern. You return to your capital at the head of your army. The townsfolk line the streets and cheer your banner. You dismount and journey to the cathedral to give thanks. You kneel before the altar and pray for all those who serve under your command. You learn that war's end brings relief and remembrance, and that a king must honor both the living and the fallen. Late into the night, you lie in your bed and feel the ache of every wound. You taste the smoke in your mouth and recall the cries of the fallen. You learn that a king in war carries not only a crown but also the scars of every battle fought under his name. You awake before dawn to the sound of drums and trumpets echoing through the corridors. Today marks the celebration of your treaty with the King of the South. You dress in your finest robes of velvet trimmed with golden embroidery and climb to the dais in the great hall. Torches line the walls and the tables beneath gleam with polished plate. You learn that a feast is a display of power and prosperity, and that every cup offered carries a message of alliance. You gesture to the steward, and the doors swing open. Row upon row of tables filled with goblets of spiced wine and platters of roast swan stretch across the hall. Musicians tune lutes and viols in a gallery above. You hear the clatter of feet as courtiers take their places. You know that every detail matters when you invite allies to dine. A single empty cup could become a slight remembered for years. You rise to speak. You welcome your guests and speak of friendship, bound by mutual respect. You praise the fertility of his lands and your wish to share in each other's blessings. He nods and raises his goblet. You sip the wine and feel its warmth. You learn that words offered over wine hold more weight than words offered at court. The first course arrives. Bowls of pottage steaming hot are ladled onto plates of pewter. The stew of lentils and legumes is rich with herbs and bacon. You taste a spoonful and note its flavor. You learn that a hearty first course prepares the stomach for the more lavish dishes to come. You learn that even a simple dish can become a symbol of hospitality when offered in royal style. Between courses, you rise to dance with the queen. Musicians play a gentle air. You lead her through the steps you practiced for days. You feel the weight of eyes upon you, but you move with grace. You learn that spectacle extends beyond the table to every gesture you make. The next course arrives. Trenchers heaped with roasted game and fowl arrive in a triumph of presentation. Swooping cranes of poultry bound in ribbons sit beside haunches of venison drizzled in honey. You slice the meat with a knife of tempered steel and savor its succulence. You learn that lavish ingredients show your wealth and impress those whose loyalty you desire. Yet, in the kitchens you know that many of your subjects go without bread tonight. You recalled the report of the harvest that failed in the highlands. Frost and spring hail destroyed much of the barley. You send a silent prayer for the families in those remote valleys. You learn that every feast a king holds can shine a light on shortages elsewhere. A minstrel begins a ballad of heroic deeds. His voice echoes, and the hall grows quiet. You gesture for silence. You notice the steward at the edge of the dais, glancing at a tablet where the balance of accounts is kept. You recall the sums spent on this feast. You think of the next levy you must impose to replenish the treasury. You learn that every extravagance carries a hidden cost to your realm. The third course arrives. Silver tureens filled with stewed fish and spiced citrus sit before you. Saffron and cinnamon perfume the air. You taste a piece of fish that flakes like snow. You lean back and close your eyes at its flavor. You learn that exotic spices show connections to distant markets, and that such foods enhance your prestige. In the gallery above you, spot a page slipping a note to his master, a baron seated at the opposite end of the table. You sense that political whispers travel faster than any trumpet. You learn that feasts also serve as meeting places for secret schemes, and that you must remain alert even in celebration. The steward approaches your dais and bows. He whispers that the rain has returned to the north, and that the peasants fear the spring barley will be drowned. He begs permission to send relief grain from the storehouses. You recall your oath to protect the needy. You learn that mercy must follow spectacle. You nod once and the steward hurries away. Wine flows freely. Courtiers rise to toast your health in several languages. You feel the strain of your crown even as you smile. You learn that a feast tests your endurance as much as a campaign tests your sword arm. Through the haze of spiced wine, you glimpse the steward returning with the Baron of the North. He kneels and thanks you for the grain. You learn that small acts of charity at the right moment can strengthen loyalty more than the richest banquet. The final course arrives. Almond cakes and honey pastries dusted with sugar shine on trays. Your favorite violet jam thickens each bite. You learn that sweet endings leave lasting memories and reinforce the bonds of fellowship. You scoop a morsel and let its sweetness fill your mouth. You feel warmth and goodwill spread through the hall. At last, the feast draws to a close. You rise and declare your guests honored and welcome in your halls. You learn that a successful feast sets the tone for alliances that outlive a single meal. You watch as your allies bow and file out to the gardens for fresh air. You learn that the halls must breathe again after a night of indulgence. You retire to your private chambers where the candles still gutter. You remove your velvet robes and hang them neatly for the next celebration. You feel the ache in your side from riding and the dull throb in your head from the wine. You recall the guards you saw at the gates, preparing to distribute the relief grain to starving villages. You learn that a king must balance banquets and famines, ensuring that his people are fed even as he honors treaties with lavish hospitality. Before sleep, you review the accounts of the feast. You note the surplus wine to be stored, the meat left for the hospital, and the cost of exotic spices. You renew your plans to tax the merchants whose wealth paid for this night's splendor. You learn that each feast must be planned with an eye toward replenishment, and that overindulgence invites ruin. As you lie on your silk sheets, you hear the distant toll of the city bell. It warns of a poor family lost in the streets. You rise and dispatch a servant to bring them bread and ale. You cloak yourself and go out with a small escort. You find the family shivering and hungry. You kneel and tend to their wounds. You learn that a king must walk among his people and bring comfort in ways unseen by the court. You return at dawn to the hushed halls. You pass the empty tables and the silent kitchens. You learn that feasts come and go, but the memory of charity endures in the hearts of your subjects. You lie back on your bed and close your eyes. You vow to hold your next feast with moderation and to feed your people as you honor your allies. You learn that the feast and the famine are two sides of the same crown, and that a true king must wield both wisely. The morning after the grand banquet, you awake to urgent knockings at your bedchamber door. Your steward enters, face pale beneath the morning light. He bears a basket of withered stalks and shriveled beans from the western plains. The harvest failed again, he says, and the villagers starve on what little seed remains. You feel the feast's opulence turn in your stomach to ash. You learn that while you dined like a monarch, your people suffered as beggars. You summon your council before the first light reaches the windows. The same barons who clamored for lavish entertainments now present grim faces. They speak of desperate peasants rioting outside manor gates, of midwives gathering newborns too weak to feed. You learn that celebrations and crises can follow one another so swiftly that a king must turn from indulgence to mercy in a single breath. Your treasurer reports that the granaries are half empty. Last year's surplus was spent on fortifications and on your latest tournament. You have little in reserve. You learn that every coin and every sheaf of grain must be balanced between honoring your word to the people and defending the realm. You order the recall of troop rations and redirect half the army's grain allowance to the hospitals and work farms. The marshal objects. He reminds you that the army's discipline depends on steady supplies. You counter that an army cannot march on empty stomachs, nor can it defend a realm when its citizens collapse in the fields. You learn that leadership demands choosing between security and compassion. You next turn to the Merchants' Guild. You summon their leaders to the palace courtyard. They arrive in fine cloaks and bow before you. You speak plainly. The famine affects the market's stability. Your peasants cannot buy seed or pay rents, and unrest will spread unless they release grain held in reserve. The master merchant hesitates, pointing to the guild's contracts for foreign export. You remind him that you, as king, can revoke those privileges and levy extraordinary duties. You learn that commerce yields to royal need when the crown wields both authority and threat. Under your decree, the guild surrenders a portion of their stocks at fair market prices. You arrange for the grain to be stored in royal barns and distributed under guard to the hardest hit villages. Crowds gather at dawn to receive rations. You ride among them and distribute bread with your own hands. You see tears of gratitude on weathered faces. You learn that acts of direct mercy bind a king's subjects to him more tightly than any feudal oath, yet relief must be calculated. You cannot feed every mouth at once, or deplete your reserves before spring. You instruct your stewards to prioritize families with young children and the elderly. You establish work camps where able-bodied peasants clear and repair roads in exchange for food. You learn that charity combined with opportunity restores both sustenance and dignity. Meanwhile, the Baron of the Northern Marches demands exemption from the relief program. He claims his lands are untouched by the famine, and that his own tenants can manage without royal grain. You remind him that the realm's strength relies on solidarity, that no one is safe until all are fed. He grudgingly agrees to share in the distribution, though his steward sends only a fraction of his stores. You learn that even among your allies, self-interest can overshadow communal need. As weeks pass, you see the impact of relief. Riots subside, and more peasants return to their plows. You ride through the countryside to inspect the work camps. You find men kneading mud and stones into roadbeds, forging paths that will carry next year's harvest to market. You learn that in managing famine, you forge the infrastructure that underpins future prosperity. Yet the failure of the crops cannot be solved by redistribution alone. You summon your chief agronomist and ask for plans to protect against next year's climate risks. He proposes draining marshlands, terracing hillsides, and planting hardier grains. You decree a program of land improvement funded by a special levy on vineyards and orchards. You learn that a king's duty extends beyond relief into investment in the kingdom's resilience. Day by day, the hunger eases, but fear lingers. You order a harvest festival, a modest affair compared to your earlier banquet, but heartfelt in its simplicity. The tables hold bread and cheese, root vegetables roasted over open fires, and mead brewed from surviving honey. You ask no foreign envoys to attend. Instead, you invite only your people. You learn that humility and solidarity can heal more wounds than resplendent feasts for the powerful. At the festival, you ride into the crowd wearing a simple cloak instead of velvet and no crown. You kneel before a clutch of peasant children and hand them bowls of stew. You hear their laughter fill the air like music. You learn that a king's greatest strength lies in being among his people, sharing their hardships and their hopes. That evening, you reflect on the balance you have struck. You preserved enough grain for your armies and saved your treasury from ruin. You soothed public unrest and laid the groundwork for a more secure harvest next year. You know that neither lavish banquets nor austere levies alone can sustain a kingdom. You learn that wise rule requires alternating between feast and famine with foresight and with compassion. Before you sleep, you draft your annual address. You will praise your allies and merchants for their contributions and promise further land reforms. You will pledge to invest in irrigation and in seed stocks. You will ask your people for continued patience and remind them that together you overcame hunger. You learn that a king's words, spoken at the right moment, can rally a realm beyond any banquet hall. Tonight, you rest on a simple pallet of straw, a silent reminder of the hunger you conquered and of the solidarity you forged with your people. You learn that the crown's true power rests not in gold or grain, but in the trust between king and subject. A trust earned equally by lavish hospitality and by mercy in famine. You awaken before dawn to the sight of your council gathered in the solar chamber. The flicker of candlelight reveals faces drawn with calculation rather than joy. Today you must decide on the marriage of your only daughter and heir. You dress in simple robes, for ceremony is far off until alliances are sealed. You learn that royal weddings are not unions of love, but complex transactions in power and land. Your chancellor unfurls a map on the table. He points to the eastern duchy across the river, where your people have long traded wheat for copper. The duke there offers his eldest son as bridegroom and vows military support in return for a dowry that includes half the control of fertile fields. The field you once walked as a boy now lies on the bargaining table. You learn that a daughter's hand becomes the price of future peace or future conflict. The Queen Mother offers her counsel. She reminds you that several generations ago, your own marriage to her sister brought a century of unity. She speaks of the joys she found in her husband's court and the children born of that bond. Yet you know that memory sweetens what was in fact a ledger of lands, exchanged and treaties signed. You learn that even those marriage tales told as romance began with cold calculations of advantage. A messenger from the southern kingdom arrives with a sealed letter. He bows deeply and hands you the duke of that land's proposal. The duke stands ready to send his niece to your court in exchange for trade privileges on the mountain passes and for safe conduct for his merchants. You recall how those passes once saw armies pillage your villages. You learn that opening trade can comfort your purse and expose your realm to danger. You call for your daughter to join you. She enters quietly, eyes wide beneath her braid of silken hair. You see the weight in her shoulders, the burden of duty she will carry for the rest of her life. You must ask her consent, but know that refusal could ignite war. You learn that in royal marriages, daughters become hostages to peace and that even consent can be a formality. You present both proposals side by side. You ask her for her thoughts. She looks to the east and speaks of the sun who once gave her a carved wooden bird in her hand. She speaks of laughter and long walks in autumn light. You sense warmth in her voice. Then she looks south and mentions a grand court where poets speak her name. You learn that your daughter sees more than strategy and that her heart hopes for a life beyond politics. The Duke from the east calls to you through a herald. He insists that time is short and that bandits threaten the passes your merchants must use. He urges you to decide swiftly so that his troops can arrive before winter snows block the roads. You learn that a suitor will press you for an answer, as if your realm depends on the moment you utter yes or no. The messenger from the south warns that a rival king courts your ally in the east. He claims that the southern duke fears being outflanked if you choose the eastern match. His voice trembles with urgency. You learn that every offer carries the echo of another offer, and that the choices you make can set off ripples across distant thrones. Your steward enters with ledgers of the dowries. The numbers listed scribble themselves across your mind. Grain stores enough to feed 2 villages for months. tolls from market towns and iron ore from your mines. You see the cost of this marriage in cold numbers. You learn that dowries become the measure of your daughter's worth and the weight of your realm's commitments. You stand at the window overlooking your gardens. The morning air carries the scent of jasmine and rose. You recall your own courtship and the laughter you once shared with your queen. You remember how once you believed in love. You learn that now love must bow to duty, and that heirs carry the hopes of crowns more heavily than vows spoken at altars. You call your council to order once more. You lay out the terms of each proposal and ask for their counsel. The Chancellor warns that the Eastern Match secures your northern border and defends your lands. The Queen Mother urges you to consider your daughter's happiness. The Chamberlain presses for the Southern Pact and the promise of trade riches. You learn that even those you trust will counsel you in conflicting directions. You rise and speak with clarity. You thank each suitor for their offers. You acknowledge the benefits each alliance brings. Then you speak of your daughter and of the realm she will one day inherit. You say that your choice must serve the people as well as the throne. You learn that a king's wisdom best shows when he speaks of his duty to his subjects, even above his own gain. You send envoys back to each court with your declaration. You select the son of the Eastern Duke for your daughter's hand. You choose grains and fields over trade privileges. You learn that you have chosen security and unity before commerce and culture. A hush greets your decision. The Eastern Duke will send his knights forthwith. The Southern messenger bows his head and withdraws. You sense in his silence the sting of rejection. You learn that alliances gain power not only by acceptance, but by the sting of refusal endured with dignity. After the formal vows, you find your daughter in the rose garden. You offer her your arm and speak softly of the life ahead. She smiles and bows her head. You see her gathering strength in that moment. You learn that royal children can find resilience in duty when comfort in choice is no longer possible. That evening, a banquet celebrates the betrothal. You dine with the Duke of the East and his retinue. Toasts rise to the future and to peace. You learn that a successful marriage pact strengthens not only two lines, but also binds entire realms in hope and promise. Later, you slip away from the hall to your private quarters. You sit at a simple table and write your final orders. You instruct the steward to prepare dowry shipments of coin and grain. You summon the master of ceremonies to prepare for the wedding procession. You learn that the work of forging an alliance continues long after vows are spoken. Before sleep, you kneel at your bedside. You pray for your daughter and for your realm. You ask that the marriage you arranged may bring peace rather than conflict. You learn that even in the cold calculations of power, a king holds a father's hope in his heart. Tonight you rest beneath the crown that weighs above your brow. You know that tomorrow your daughter becomes a bride of state. You know that her safety and her happiness now lie in the hands of foreign courtiers and distant politics. You learn that royal unions bind dynasties and destinies alike, and that only the boldest or the most desperate dare to place their heirs on the altar of power. The sun rises on the day your daughter departs for her new home. You stand on the castle's western gate, your cloak heavy with the weight of parting words. At your side stands the Eastern Duke's envoy, a stern knight who will escort her across the border. Your daughter, arrayed in silk and jewels, lifts a trembling hand in farewell. You learn that sending a child as a pledge of peace transforms blood bonds into political bonds. The envoy steps forward and bows. He promises safe conduct and honorable treatment. You study his face and search for any hint of falsehood. You know that a hostage can be both a guarantee and a cage. You learn that no promise can erase the fear that a future emergency might turn a bride into a bargaining chip. Your daughter mounts her palfrey and takes her place between two pages. The knight places a guiding hand on her elbow and slowly leads the procession through the town. Courtiers and townsfolk line the walls, their faces a mixture of pride and sorrow. You hear the murmur of prayers and of whispered fears. You learn that a kingdom's joy in an alliance carries also its grief in parting. As the procession winds through the valley, you recall the halls where she played as a child, the rose garden where she chased butterflies, the marble fountain where she learned to toss coins for luck. Each memory becomes a farewell gift you carry in your heart. You learn that royal hostages inhabit a realm of emptiness before they even arrive at their destination. 6 days later, you receive word that she has reached the Duke's castle. She is lodged in a wing behind a courtyard gate flanked by guards. She sends a letter in your daughter's hand, a simple verse of gratitude for her new lord's hospitality. You read her neat script and feel both relief and anguish. You learn that a hostage's words can comfort, but never erase the fear that binds her fate to politics. Weeks pass and reports arrive daily. The steward of the Duke's household praises her manners and her kindness toward the children of his court. He sends small gifts of cloth and embroidery silks as tokens of esteem. You learn that hostages often live in splendor, while their own people endure sacrifice. You wonder how such disparity shapes her mind and tears at her loyalty to her homeland. Your spies whisper of factions at the Eastern Court. Some favor your daughter's arrival as a sign of alliance. Others resent the influx of dowry and the power her marriage brings to the Duke's family. You learn that even as a bride, she becomes a focal point for intrigue. You wonder whether her safety depends on the goodwill of those who once welcomed her. In your council, you review the treaties that bind your hands should conflict flare once more. You note clauses that allow the Duke to hold your daughter until peace is restored. You feel a chill at the thought that in time of crisis you might trade land or coin simply to secure her return. You learn that a hostage embodies an unspoken threat that haunts every royal decision. One night you gather your generals to plan a northern campaign. The fields there lie ripe for harvest, but under threat from raiding bands. You hesitate to commit troops. You remember the treaty's clause that any attack on the Duke's vassals requires the return of your daughter before any military expedition. You learn that sending your armies to defend your realm could cost you her freedom. You send emissaries to the Eastern Court with gifts of ivory and rare wines. You propose a joint demonstration of force against the raiders rather than a unilateral campaign. You hope to avoid the terms that imprison your daughter. You learn that in alliance, as in marriage, each party seeks advantage in every maneuver. Meanwhile, you receive a plea from your daughter. She writes of her longing for home and the loneliness of palace corridors. She asks for letters from her mother and for news of the gardens she left behind. You learn that hostages carry the weight of exile in every breath they take. You write back with words of comfort and news of court affairs. You include a pressed rose and a sprig of lavender from your own garden. You learn that small tokens of home can heal a heart aching in foreign lands. Rainy days bring fewer reports. You worry that a flood may trap the envoy and that your daughter will be confined by swollen rivers. You order local bridges reinforced and a guard detail dispatched to ensure her movement. You learn that a hostage's safety demands more vigilance than any army camp. Months on the border, your daughter attends the Duke's council. She speaks in measured tones and offers counsel on court matters. She wins praise for her wisdom beyond her years. You learn that hostages can gain influence in their host courts and that their value extends beyond the promise of ransom. You recall the princess of the neighboring kingdom taken years before your daughter's birth. She became the Duke's confidant and advisor, her own father forced to negotiate with her brothers for her return. You learn that hostages can become stakeholders in the politics that surround them. When the annual harvest festival comes, the Duke invites your envoy to bring a delegation. You send your chamberlain with a gift of silken rugs and candlesticks of silver. You learn that hostages become the living link between courts, and that gifts reinforce bonds that might fray with neglect. Under candlelight, your envoy meets with the Duke's council in a grand hall of polished marble. They sign treaties, renewing trade agreements and pledging military support against common foes. You learn that while your daughter watches at the window, she remains both prize and promise in the negotiations. Each time you dine in your own halls, you think of her seated in a distant chamber, gazing at a different feast. You wonder whether she tastes the same spices and whether the candles glow as warmly. You learn that in hostage marriages the bride shifts between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. The seasons turn, and you receive word that your daughter is with child. You learn that hostages sometimes become the mothers of heirs in their host courts. You imagine the child's blood mixing two dynasties, and you realize that a marriage pact can reshape the map of power for generations. You chair a council meeting to discuss terms of your daughter's return upon her husband's succession to the duchy. You negotiate the timing and the conditions, ensuring that her future as duchess secures your realm's safety. You learn that hostages return only when they have fulfilled their roles as symbols and as instruments of alliance. Finally, after several years, your daughter sends word that her husband has been crowned. She writes that she may soon return to her father's court to claim her inheritance and to rule as queen. You learn that a hostage's fate culminates in the very promise that cost her her freedom for so long. At the welcome home ceremony, you stand once more at the castle gates. You see your daughter descend from her litter, now a queen in her own right. You feel both pride and sorrow for the years she spent as a pledge. You learn that royal marriages demand the ransom of children's youth and the forging of bonds that outlast life itself. You embrace her beneath the banners of your house. You learn that hostages may one day return to their own thrones, yet the memory of their sacrifice remains etched into every alliance their fathers made in the name of peace. You wake in the dead of night to the distant echo of a door sliding on its hinges. Your heart pounds as you slip from your bed, the silk sheets falling away like shadows. You move through the silent corridors to the private chapel and kneel before the altar. You pray for guidance, yet know that prayer alone cannot guard you from the glass of wine laced with subtle poison. You learn that a king's cup can carry both blessing and death. At dawn, you hold council over breakfast. A cup of spiced wine cools in your palm. You invite your closest advisors and watch their faces as you sip. You taste a faint bitterness and pause. You catch the glance of your chamberlain as he hesitates with his own cup. You order all wine servants questioned and their hands tested for poison. You learn that suspicion becomes a knife sharper than any blade. That afternoon you retreat to your solar and inspect the goblet you drank from. You call for the royal apothecary, who examines the cup and detects traces of nightshade. You stare at the dark rim and feel a chill. You summon the steward and the chamberlain to stand witness. You learn that every traitor in the court could hide in plain sight behind a courteous bow and a smiling mask. You order the arrest of the wine steward who served the breakfast. You watch as he protests his loyalty, tears in his eyes, but the guards bind him nonetheless. He swears he is innocent. You learn that in the thirst for security, even the truly loyal must suffer scrutiny, and that justice bends under the crown's fear. That night, you sleep lightly on a camp bed within your bedchamber. Guards patrol the antechamber, and beyond the door to your private apartments, you hear their boots tapping on the marble floor. You feel their presence both comforting and oppressive. You learn that a king's rest is never true rest, but only a brief respite between watchful hours. You rise before dawn and convene the court physician and the master of spies. You demand answers to who might wish you dead. You recall every quarrel, every offended noble, every rival in the neighboring kingdom. You learn that a ruler's enemies outnumber his friends, and that every smile could hide a dagger. You decide to vary your routine. You leave the bedchamber by secret passages and travel to the council hall through hidden stairways. You change your hunting mounts and travel with small escorts rather than the large processions that advertise your route. You learn that privacy can be protection and that a king must never show himself predictable. In the council chamber, you receive a letter from an anonymous hand. The ink warns you not to trust the Baron of the Western Fief who delivered taxes late last season. You call for him to appear. He arrives with his knights, in full armor, unbowed. He denies any plot. You learn that letters without a seal can be both warning and trap, and that every accusation must be weighed against evidence and intent. Late that evening, you attend a feast in your private salon. You watch the cup at your side as if it were a coiled serpent. You sip only water and nod at the servants. You see the Baron of the East Wing smile too broadly as he raises his glass. You force yourself to remain calm. You learn that a king's greatest weapon is composure in the face of mortal threat. When the feast ends, you summon your spymaster. He reports that the Baron's household is rife with danger from mercenary agents. He found coded messages buried in a pile of hides. You order the Baron's arrest and his trial before the crown. You learn that to survive a poisoned chalice, a king must strike first and strike hard. That trial reveals a network of conspirators from distant courts. You find letters linking them to foreign spies and to disloyal nobles. You execute the plot's leaders by dawn. You learn that assassination plots often carry the marks of diplomacy, and that severing treachery requires swift and public justice. After the executions, you stand alone in the tower's highest room. You look out over the realm's battlements and feel the weight of every eye upon you. You stroke the cold rim of your crown and whisper a vow to remain vigilant. You learn that the crown's metal is not heavy with jewels, but with the knowledge that at any moment the chalice may be raised again to test your fate. Tonight you return to your bedchamber and lie upon layers of fine linen. You draw the blankets up to your chin and close your eyes. You hear distant footsteps, but know they belong to your guard. You pray for sleep, yet know that tomorrow will bring new threats. You learn that for a medieval king, the sweetest rest is the promise of the dawn rather than the blind surrender of darkness. You awake to the toll of the cathedral bells, their peals more urgent than any dawn summons. You rise in haste and hasten through the corridors to the chapel outside your bedchamber. There you find your court preacher waiting, his cassock gleaming, his face etched with solemn grace. He brings word that the Pope has sent a legate demanding greater tithes and an end to lay investiture. You learn that the Church wields power not only in sermons but through the threat of excommunication. That morning you call your council to the great hall. The preacher stands before the carved crucifix and speaks of the sin of pride in kings and of the need for obedience to the Holy See. He reproaches you for appointing bishops without papal approbation and for withholding portions of the church's dues to fund your armies. His words echo through the vaulted chamber and stir unease among your barons. You learn that religious authority can sway even the most hardened noble soul. You summon your chancellor to explain the papal demands. He recounts the legate's letter in which the Pope threatens to place your realm under interdict should you refuse to comply. Under such an interdict, churches would shut their doors, no sacraments would be administered, and marriages and burials would be suspended. You imagine the panic that would follow. Peasants denied last rites, nobles unable to wed heirs, families left without burial rites. You learn that excommunication brings suffering to all levels of society and can erode your very legitimacy. That afternoon you meet with your archbishop in the private dining chamber. He sits across from you, a gentle figure in flowing robes, and pleads for you to yield to the legate's demands. He recalls the martyrdom of saints who died defending the church's rights and reminds you that a king, under sentence of excommunication, stands abandoned by heaven. You learn that even your closest clerical allies may speak with fire in their hearts, and that resistance could cost you both crown and soul. As dusk falls, you ride into the cathedral precincts. You bow before the grand doors and enter to find the pews filled with worried faces. The preacher stands at the pulpit and addresses the flock. He warns that no baptism or communion will be offered until the king submits to the Pope's will. You watch mothers clutch their children and knights tighten their gauntlets. You learn that a king's struggle with the church plays out in the hearts of his people. Back in your private solar, you call for a gathering of your trusted friends. You weigh the options. Submit fully to papal authority and sacrifice some power over appointments, or resist and risk an interdict that could spark rebellion. You recall the revolt of a neighboring kingdom, where the king's refusal led to barons transferring their loyalty to the church. You learn that defiance can unite your enemies and invite foreign intervention under the banner of holiness. Late into the night, you pen a letter to the Pope. You propose a compromise. You will restore certain ecclesiastical rights and remit overdue tithes, and in turn, the legate will confirm your current appointments and lift any sentence of interdict. You learn that diplomacy with the church requires humility and the willingness to give ground in matters of prestige. At dawn, a messenger returns with the papal reply. The Pope accepts your offer, but demands that you perform public penance before the cathedral steps and donate 100 marks of silver to the poor. You bow your head and arrange for the penance to take place on the morrow. You learn that kings must sometimes wear sackcloth and ashes to maintain their crowns. The next day, you stand before the cathedral doors clothed in simple garments. Your courts have gathered in silence. You kneel at the threshold as the preacher sprinkles holy water and recites prayers. You feel the sting of humility in every breath. Behind you, the bishops gaze solemnly. You learn that the visible act of submission restores the church's favor and preserves your realm's unity. After the ceremony, the Pope's legate declares the sentence of interdict lifted. The cathedral bells ring in joyous peal. You retire to your hall and share modest feasts with those who stood by you. You learn that reconciliation with the church brings relief deeper than any banquet. In the days that follow, you restore tithes to the church's coffers and confirm the episcopal appointments. You see your people return to their parish churches for Mass and for the sacraments. You learn that the preacher's fury has passed, but that the memory of the threat remains. Each year you remember that season of tension. You balance your right to invest bishops with the church's demand for autonomy. You host synods, and you temper your decrees with deference to the pulpit. You learn that ruling alongside the church requires not only the crown's strength, but also the humility to kneel in penance. You wake one morning with your head heavy and your mouth bitter with fever. You feel a prickling itch beneath your skin as though tiny insects crawl beneath your flesh. Your chamberlain offers you a poultice of mustard seeds plastered to a cloth. He presses it against your side, and the heat stings like fire. You learn that medieval medicine relies on pain to drive out pain, and that every cure can feel as brutal as the illness itself. You summon the royal physician to your bedside. He enters in a cloak, stained by herbs and blood. He examines your pulse at wrist and neck, then nods gravely. He declares that your humors are unbalanced, and that you must undergo a course of bloodletting and purging. You learn that the human body was once thought a series of vessels to be emptied rather than healed. You lie on a table as the physician raises a sharpened lancet to your arm. A servant holds your hand while the doctor makes a shallow incision. Warm blood wells, and you hear the servant pour it into a bowl. The doctor watches the flow and declares the color too dark. He tips the bowl and examines the drip. He repeats the process. You learn that medieval healers sought truth in the sight of your blood, and that each drop could save or condemn you. After bleeding, you sit by the window and watch as the blood dries on the bowl's rim. You feel hollow and weak. The physician returns with a large goblet of herbs steeped in oil. He tells you to drink the bitter brew to purge your stomach. You lift the vessel and the stench hits you first. You gag and swallow. You taste earth and rot and feel the potion work its way down. You learn that purging was the cure for every ill, and that each convulsion brought them one step closer to health or to doom. The next day, you awaken to a rash that covers your arms. It ignites with red sores that itch beyond belief. You scratch until your nails draw blood. The chamberlain brings a cream made of crushed herbs and animal fat. You smear it over your sores. It feels cool at first, then burns with every movement. You learn that soothing ointments could inflame as much as they could heal. Your servants report that you have lost weight, and that your voice trembles with each word. The physician returns, this time with a cup of wine mixed with ground pearls and crushed gemstones. He insists that the minerals will strengthen your blood and restore your vigor. You sip the mixture and taste chalk and dust. You feel a moment of relief as the wine warms your throat. You learn that alchemy mingled with medicine, and that the cost of remedies could rival the ransom of a noble hostage. That night, you drift in and out of fever dreams. You see giants of flame chasing you through corridors. You hear whispers promising eternal life in exchange for your crown. You awaken shuddering and call for water. The servant brings a bowl of cold water that tastes of lead piping and mildew. You sip only enough to wet your lips. You learn that the purest cures often came from wells with hidden dangers. In the morning, a monk visits with a chest of relics and blessed oils. He dips a finger into a vial of sanctified water and touches your forehead. He prays for your health and presses a piece of parchment stamped with wax to your chest. He claims the relic will ward off evil spirits that afflict the body. You learn that faith mingles with medicine and that salvation might lie in prayer as much as in poultices. As days pass, you grow weaker. Your cough rattles in your chest and you struggle to breathe. The physician prescribes a poultice of onion and honey for your lungs. You smear the mixture on your chest and wrap it in cloth. The smell turns your stomach. You learn that simple ingredients could become the most noxious medicines. Your advisors gather outside your door to discuss the state of your health. The chancery will run short if you cannot hold counsel soon. The steward fears that enemies will sense your weakness and strike. You learn that a sick king invites rebellion, and that your body becomes the realm's greatest vulnerability. A famous healer arrives from a distant land. He carries spices and silks in his satchel and a quiet confidence in his eyes. He claims to cure by blood letting less and by herbal infusions more. He offers you a tea made of gentler grasses and barks that promise to soothe the stomach and calm the fever. You drink the amber liquid and taste sweetness for the first time in days. You learn that new ideas sometimes challenge old methods, and that every patient must weigh risk against hope. Your fever breaks that night, and you rest in peace. You awaken with strength returning, but also with new concerns. The healer warns that the potion must be repeated for a fortnight, or the fever will return. You learn that cures often demand prolonged suffering and devotion. You hold a private council with your closest ministers. You appear weaker than before, but steadier in mind. You pledge to fund the healer's mission to bring his methods to every city in your realm. You learn that health of the king can drive policy, and that even in sickness a ruler shapes the kingdom's future. Over the next weeks, you see the rashes fade and your strength return. The onion poultice yields to more palatable teas. The bleeding stops and your voice grows firm. You learn that medicine of the age could harm as much as heal, but that through trial and care recovery remained possible. When you ride again, you feel the stir of life in your limbs. You tour the royal apothecaries and order them to stock gentler herbs alongside the traditional remedies. You grant lands to monks who cultivate medicinal gardens. You learn that a king who survives disease can leave a legacy of improved care for his people. Yet you do not forget the chill of your nights or the taste of dust in your medicines. You know that in an age of leech jars and bile itches, the healer's knot binds patient and physician in a dance between hope and despair. You learn that true health demands not only remedies, but also wisdom to choose them carefully. You awaken one morning to the tolling of the great bell echoing through empty corridors. You dress hastily and hurry to the council chamber, heart pounding. There you find your chancellor, pale and trembling. He reaches into his robe and produces a scroll sealed with the royal crest. "My liege," he says, "our prince has passed in the night." Your stomach drops. You learn that mortal frailty spares no heir, and that a kingdom's future can vanish in a single breath. The chamber falls silent as your daughter, The princess kneels before you. Tears stain her cheeks. You rise and gather her in your arms. You feel her small form tremble with grief. You learn that the bonds of blood can be both a source of strength and a wound that deepens every danger. You summon your council to mourn and then to plan. Without a clear heir, the realm stands leaderless upon your death. You recall your own youth, when your father declared you heir despite rival claims. You remember the skirmishes and the secret meetings that tested his hold on the throne. You learn that whenever an heir dies, the threat of civil war lights like tinder in every court and every fief. Your brother, the Duke of the Northern Marches, steps forward. He bows his head, but his eyes glint with ambition. "My brother," he says quietly, "I stand ready to serve the realm in this time of need." You see the barons behind him exchange looks. You learn that every collateral kinsman becomes a claimant when the direct line falters. Your daughter interrupts you with a question in a trembling voice. "Father, who will follow me?" You kneel and place a hand on her shoulder. "We will secure the succession, you promise. We will name your cousin as heir until you come of age." She nods, but you sense her uncertainty. You learn that councils can bind a crown but not always quell a daughter's fear. You convene a great assembly in the great hall. Barons, bishops, knights, and city guild masters gather beneath the banners of every noble house. You rise before them and speak of your daughter's right to rule and of the need for a regent until her majority. You propose your humble self as regent. A murmur rises. Some applaud your loyalty, others shift in their seats, thinking of alternate successors. You learn that even a king's proposal invites quiet opposition from those who covet the throne. A rival claimant appears in the back of the hall. He is the young Earl of the Western Fief, your nephew and a disappointment in your youth. He kneels before your dais and asks for the honor of serving as protector of the realm. He offers his sword and his armies. You see the barons from his own lands nodding support. You learn that claimants can rally followers with gifts of tithe exemptions and promises of land redistribution. You call for order and remind everyone of the ancient law of succession. You read aloud the charter that grants primogeniture to your daughter. You learn that written law serves as your strongest defense, but that law must be upheld by force as much as by parchment. That night you ride the battlements with your captain of the guard. He tells you that banners bearing your nephew's arms have been raised on distant keeps. He fears word of your daughter's death emboldened his partisans. You order garrisons strengthened around key castles and messengers sent to every noble to reaffirm loyalty to your daughter. You learn that a succession crisis demands both legal authority and swift military readiness. You spend the next days dispatching envoys to neighboring rulers. You fear that foreign princes might exploit your weakened state. You seek letters of recognition for your daughter from distant kings. You learn that every crown must secure its borders in diplomacy, as well as in arms when its succession trembles. Back in the council chamber, you debate regency councils. Some say the Queen Mother should share power with you. Others propose a committee of barons. You sense the fault lines among your advisors. You learn that regencies can fracture realms slice by slice as each regent wields authority in turn. Your daughter grows pale and restless. You find her in the rose garden weeping among the withered blooms. You kneel and hold her hand. You promise that you will protect her birthright. You learn that a king's greatest strength lies in comforting a child even as he girds himself for war. You decide to appoint the Queen Mother and the Archbishop as joint regents alongside yourself. You announce your choice in the great hall before the assembled nobility. You learn that virtue in a regent appeals to both court and church, and that a balance of piety and lineage can calm fierce ambition. Your nephew protests but bows to your decision. You grant him lands and titles in exchange for his loyalty. You learn that generous settlements can turn claimants into allies, even as they burn with envy. Within weeks, you stockpile horses and armaments in strategic keeps. You deploy knights loyal to you along the high road. You station crossbowmen atop every tower. You learn that nothing secures a succession like the threat of force poised to strike at any rebellion. In the dead of night, you receive word of a plot against you. A conspirator in your nephew's retinue intended to poison your wine. You order the culprit seized and interrogated. Under questioning, he names others among the Earl's household. The Earl himself feigns innocence, but you see the walls close in on him. You learn that assassination and betrayal walk hand in hand with every disputed succession. You convene a midnight trial in the great hall's shadowed corners. You pass sentence swiftly. The conspirators are hanged at dawn. You summon your nephew to watch. His eyes betray fear and repentance. He kneels before you and swears his oath anew. You learn that public justice can both punish treachery and bind a rival to his word. As the seasons turn, you solidify the regency and secure your daughter's court. The barons of the West swear fealty once more. The foreign king of the South sends envoys bearing gifts and promises of military support if your daughter sits upon the throne unchallenged. You learn that alliances forged in crisis can strengthen a realm, but always at a price. On the eve of your daughter's 16th birthday, you plan the ceremony of her coronation. You prepare the crown, the scepter, and the ancient robes. You invite the highest prelates and the boldest knights. You learn that the moment an heir is crowned secures the succession in both law and in ceremony. When the day arrives, you lead the procession into the cathedral and place the crown upon her brow. The bells toll and the people cheer. You see your daughter stand tall as the crown settles in place. You learn that a kingdom's future depends on such moments of unity and on the resolve of one young sovereign. Outside the cathedral, your nephew kneels and kisses your daughter's hand. He pledges his sword in her name. You learn that at last the succession has been sealed and that the threats lurking in every shadow have been laid to rest, at least until the next generation claims its own destiny. You awaken to the ringing of alarm bells and the shouts of sentries in the courtyard below. You rise from your bed of velvet and silk, heart pounding, and cross the chamber to peer through the arrow slit. Smoke curls over the city walls and banners bearing strange heraldry flutter in the wind. The enemy has breached the outer gate. You learn in that moment that kingdoms built on loyalty can collapse in a single night. You dress hastily in mail and cloak and stride down the spiral stair to the great hall. Your captains line the walls, leaning on swords and shaking their heads. You demand to know what has happened. A breathless guard reports that peasants and townsfolk have risen in rebellion at dawn, and that foreign mercenaries slipped across the river under cover of darkness. You learn that, when trust fractures between ruler and ruled, then any foe can slip through the breach. You call your council immediately. Your chancellor, your marshal, and your chamberlain assemble around the carved oak table. You hear the chorus of arguments. The chancellor urges negotiation, the marshal demands a charge, and the chamberlain begs caution to protect your person. You sense the walls closing in. You learn that in the hour of greatest peril advice comes in a torrent, and that every voice seeks to bend your decision. You order the drawbridge raised and the gates barred. You send runners to muster the household guard and to summon levies from the nearby manors. You don your helm and shoulder your sword. You ride to the front gate to rally your men. You learn that a king must lead from the front when fear grips his soldiers. At the gate you find a mass of rebels armed with farm tools and shabby weapons. Beside them stand hired swords in steel and mail. Their banners bear the crest of your rival cousin who claims your crown by right of conquest. You learn that ambition sometimes comes in the guise of justice and that a crown can be seized by force of arms. You shout a call to parley and ride forward alone. The rebel captain steps forth and spurns your plea for peaceful resolution. He hurls insults at your rule and demands your abdication. You see the foreign commander smile, revealing teeth stained by wine. You learn that words can weaken resolve as swiftly as an arrow through leather. Without further warning, the rebel captain signals his men and they charge. You spur your horse into the fray. Steel rings on steel. You feel the impact of axe and mace. You strike out with your sword, but a mercenary thrusts through your guard and you stagger in the saddle. A blade bites your arm and you feel warm blood flow. You learn that no armor can shield every blow, and that a king's body is as vulnerable as any man's. Retreating is unthinkable, yet circling back risks entrapment. Your men fight bravely, but the numbers are against you. You see a gap in the rebel line and urge your horse through. You crash through enemy ranks and charge toward the keep. You learn that desperation can fuel courage beyond reason. Inside the keep, you race to the throne room. You slam the heavy oaken doors and bar them with iron bolts. You breathe hard as your chamberlain hands you a fresh cloak and a goblet of wine to staunch your bleeding arm. You learn that refuge behind walls may buy time yet never guarantee safety. The castle trembles under the pounding of siege engines outside. You hear the crash of boulders against stone. Smoke filters through arrow slits. Your court gathers in terror. You stand on the dais and proclaim that you remain their rightful sovereign. You vow to restore order and to punish the traitors. You learn that a king's word in times of crisis can rally hope or slip into empty sound. The following dawn, you lead a sally through the postern gate. Your men press forward, but the rebels hold the high ground. Arrows rain down. You shout orders and fight with ferocity. A shaft grazes your cheek, and you taste copper in your mouth. You learn that a king's battlefield wounds carry both pain and the weight of every life he orders into danger. Your men begin to falter. The foreign mercenaries press the attack and push your forces back. You see your knights surrounded and your banners torn. You urge a final charge toward the rebel standard. You lunge forward, determined to end the battle. You feel a spear pierce your side and a moment of white heat before you collapse. You learn that even the strongest can be felled when fate turns against them. You awake in a damp cell beneath the keep. Chains bind your wrists. Your armor lies cracked and rusty in a corner. You see the rebel captain stride by with your crown perched mockingly on his brow. He laughs with the foreign commander at your defeat. You learn that a king without sword or scepter becomes a prisoner of the very realm he once ruled. Days pass in darkness. You hear chants from the chapel, yet your pleas to the bishop go unanswered. The church has allied with your cousin who now sits on your throne. You learn that spiritual authority can abandon a fallen king as swiftly as the armies that once served him. Your cousin visits the cell to gloat. He offers you mercy if you resign and swear fealty. His eyes glint with triumph. You feel your blood freeze. You learn that mercy offered by traitors often means further bondage. You stand broken by the iron bars. You recall every choice that led you to this fate. You learn that a king's pride can blind him to the rot within his council and the discontent of his people. At last you are escorted from the dungeon and into the courtyard. Your cousin's court waits for your public condemnation. You mount a scaffold beneath the sun. You see the crowds gathered to witness your downfall. You raise your head and recall the oath you swore to protect them. You learn that a king's final act can be a lesson for every subject who bows before power. Your cousin pronounces you deposed. He seizes the scepter and smashes it on the stones at your feet. The crowd cheers. You learn that glory and grief can share the same moment in a realm ruled by force rather than by law. Dragged from the scaffold, you are led beyond the city gates into exile. You feel the sun on your back as you walk the road. The castle towers shrink into the distance. You learn that a king without his crown becomes as common a traveler as any beggar. Years later, you hear rumors of a desperate revolt against your usurper. Rebels claim your return will restore justice. You learn that the fall of a king can echo through time and stir hope in the hearts of those who remember his rule. But for now, you walk a narrow path between loss and survival. You carry only the memory of your throne and the humility of your defeat. You learn that the final downfall of a king can be both an end and the seed of another beginning. You gaze out over the silent halls of your once vast palace. and feel the weight of every choice you made while wearing the crown. You recall the morning you inherited the throne and the flood of ancient obligations that rolled over you like a storm. You remember the gathering of vassals whose pledges sounded like sharpened blades poised at your throat. You learn that from the first day of rule to the last, a king walks a narrow edge between loyalty and betrayal. You think of the long hours in the council chamber, where rival lords plotted your ruin behind courteous words. You felt the sting of every veiled threat as you guided discussions of roads and taxes. You learned that power resides not in proclamations from a dais, but in the whispered bargains made in shadowed corners. You recall the grind of raising revenue from a realm hungry for bread and for justice. You saw peasants kneel with hollow eyes while merchants slipped coins into hidden pockets. You learned that every coin you claimed could ignite revolt, and that a king's authority rests on a balance as delicate as a coin spun on a table. You remember the summons of war and the taste of dust and blood on your lips. You led your knights across muddy fords and beneath battlements ringed with arrows. You felt the crush of steel and the agony of wounds. You learned that a king must bear the same perils as his soldiers, and that the roar of victory carries the echo of sorrow. You recall the feasts that gleamed with silver plate and rich spices. You saw allies raise goblets in your name while winter winds chilled the starving. You learned that banquets display power yet cast long shadows over famine, and that generosity and pride can sit at the same table. You remember offering your daughter in marriage as the price of peace. You sensed her fear and your own grief as she rode away a hostage of state. You learned that royal unions bind houses and hearts alike, and that a daughter's loss becomes a kingdom's pledge. You recall the night you tasted your cup of wine and felt the first burn of poison in your veins. You faced the terror that believers call divine and traitors call opportunity. You learned that assassination waits in every friendly gesture, and that vigilance becomes the truest crown you wear. You remember the preacher's fury as he threatened interdict and excommunication. You knelt in penance beneath the cathedral's arches and felt humility kindle the spark of unity among your people. You learned that the church's power can raise kings or unmake them, and that piety can be both refuge and trap. You recall the grip of disease that seized your body. You felt the sting of lancets and the bitterness of poultices. You laughed at quacks and hoped for miracles. You learned that every remedy might kill, and that health in a king becomes the realm's fragile lifeline. You remember the moment your heir breathed his last. You watched your daughter's tears and felt the realm teeter on the brink of chaos. You named regents and guarded against claimants whispering promises of change. You learned that a succession can fracture a realm more surely than any enemy's blade. You recall the day the gates fell and your enemies took your crown. You fought beneath banners of usurpers and felt your strength slip like sand through your fingers. You learned that a king's greatest hazard lies in the loyalty he cannot command and the ambition he cannot contain. Through all these hazards, you discovered the cruel necessities of rule. You learned that mercy must be tempered with firmness, or chaos follows. You learned that generosity must be balanced against stability, or the realm unravels. You learned that humility can win hearts yet invite contempt, and that pride can hold a kingdom together yet shatter it in an instant. You feel the ghosts of every decision drifting through these halls. The ghost of the taxpayer who hungered while you feasted. The ghost of the soldier who fell in your name. The ghost of the daughter sent away to seal an alliance. The ghost of the poisoner who saw in your cup the promise of revenge. Each spectre reminds you that power demands sacrifice, and that every act of rule writes its echoes in lives you never truly own. You understand now why only the desperate or the daring raise themselves to the throne. A king must dare to shoulder burdens no mortal should ever bear. He must face betrayals that cut deeper than any sword. He must accept that his health, his heirs, and his honor lie open to every threat. He must dare to believe that the good of the realm outweighs the weight of his own fear. Yet desperation calls you to rule when no safer path exists. A land without a strong hand can fragment into war and famine. Only a ruler willing to face the gauntlet of intrigue and iron can shelter his people from the storm. You remember nights spent pacing these chambers, torn between duty and dread, yet rising each dawn to serve the realm again. You leave these empty rooms and step into the courtyard at dawn. You breathe the chill air and feel the sun's first rays on your face. You think of the future leaders yet to come. You hope they will learn from your triumphs and your failures. You pray they will bear the crown's curse with wisdom tempered by compassion. You learn that the ghosts of the realm live on in every successor who dares to wear the crown.